Alright, in this video we're going to be making a very simple mead using only 3 ingredients: water, honey, and yeast, sometimes known as a traditional mead. Before we begin, I want to give a special thanks to Scandin Scoos for becoming a member, helping support this channel. Speaking of which, this is DIY Fermentation, your site for doing fermentation on a shoestring budget. Now, to make our traditional show mead, we're going to be using the following ingredients. We're going to be using 3 pounds of raw honey. We're going to be using 1 gallon or 4 liters of filtered pure water. We're going to be using half a teaspoon of Red Star Premier Blanc wine yeast. Now, if you don't have wine yeast, this stuff will also work. It'll work a little slower, it'll work a little harder, but it should get the job done. We're going to need a jug, carboy, demijohn, take your pick, to do fermentation in. We're going to need an airlock with stopper. We're going to need a hydrometer and testing tube to determine what our alcohol level is going to eventually end up being. And using your sanitizer of choice, make sure that everything has been properly cleaned and sanitized. And that is all we're going to be using to make this mead. Now, I've taken the liberty to warm up our honey, which we're now going to pour into our fermenter. And I am going to rinse out the rest of this honey and get that in the fermenter later. But in the meantime, let's get that in there. Now, the next thing we're going to do is add in about half of our water. I mean, it doesn't have to be exactly half or anything like that, because the next thing we're going to do after that is that we're going to shake this up. Let's put our cap back on. Nice and tight. And let's get to shaking for 2 reasons. 1, to dissolve that honey, and 2, to put more oxygen in our mix, which our yeast is going to badly need later on. So it'll take about a minute or 2, closer to 2. All right, that's enough of that. Go ahead and take our cap off. Let's go ahead and add in the rest of our water. To about yay high. I'm not going to fill it up to the top because I don't know how much foam might develop later on, at least during the early stages. So I'm going to leave a fair amount of headspace. And I'm going to wait for this foam to die down before adding the yeast. All right, while we're waiting for this foam to dissipate, which apparently is going to take a little while, we may as well do something useful and take a hydrometer reading. And it looks like our hydrometer reading is coming in at 1.090. Now, using some of our water from our hydrometer test, let's bloom our yeast. Again, using half a teaspoon, which is more than I normally would use, but because we're not using yeast nutrients, yeast energizers, we're going to give this yeast a pretty good shot. Now that our yeast is beginning to show signs of life, we may as well go ahead and add that to our carboy. Now, before I put on the airlock, I want to give this one last good shake. Take off our cap, put on our airlock. Now let's go ahead and label our creation. We are making a traditional show mead. And we're starting it on this date. And our original gravity reading was 1.090. Now for the next 3 days, my plan is going to be this. Once a day, I'm going to take off the airlock, put the cap back on, give it a good shake. Take the cap off, put the airlock back on. After that 3-day period, I won't be doing any more shaking, but what I will do is that I will reduce this headspace that I've got to something a bit more reasonable. And after about 10 days or so, depending on how much leaf has developed along the bottom of the carboy. If it's about 1 finger's worth, then I'll go ahead and rack it into a secondary carboy, start the process of bulk aging, and let it go on for the next several months. Probably end up doing a total of 3 rackings until it becomes clear. I will probably let this go 12 months before giving it a tasting, and that will be my plan for this particular mead. Again, if you like what you see here, please click on the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.